Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Michael Knowles spoke at a Heritage Foundation event recently, and at that event he shared his thoughts that our largely Protestant cohort of founding fathers had deeply Catholic influences. People acted as if there was a sense of novelty in how he shared this, to which I thought, where's the news? There's honestly very little in his statement that should surprise any Christian who's spent serious time with the history of political thought. Now, don't get me wrong, Knowles is right in substance, but it's the way that this was framed. It risks making an old inheritance sound like a fresh discovery. It's not fresh discovery, this is basic knowledge. Whatever was noble, durable, humane in the American founding came through a very long civilizational river. Any student of history can tell you this. That river runs through Athens to Jerusalem, to Rome, to the Fathers, to the medieval doctors, to the School of Salamanca, and the wider natural law tradition that has been guarded and developed by the Church. So when the Declaration invokes the laws of nature and nature's God, it's drawing from that moral grammar that's, by the way, older than Philadelphia in 1776. The National Archive texts preserve that language. That language has enormous philosophical bearing because it assumes that liberty is intelligible within a created moral order. Rights are received, they're not manufactured. The government is accountable to truths higher than its own will. That entire framework is in the air of the classical and Christian natural law. So yes, it's closer to Cicero and Paul and Augustine and Aquinas than Enlightenment self-creation narratives. In fact, Paul had already given the West one of its central natural law texts, Romans chapter 2. He teaches that Gentiles show the work of the law written on their hearts. That single Pauline insight might be one of the greatest pillars for the Christian account of conscience and moral reason and public order. The Hellenistic world supplied the philosophical vocabulary, so you've got Stoicism, Ciceronian reflection, you've got Aristotle and Plato. Augustine received Plato's heritage through Plotinus and Porphyry, and he baptized it with the Christian mind. The Stanford Encyclopedia actually states Neoplatonism was Augustine's most lasting philosophical influence. By the time Aquinas was writing, he gathered together scripture and Aristotle, Augustine, Plato, Roman law, patristic wisdom, even Islamic scholars, and ecclesial judgment in this masterful synthesis. That's why this American conversation cannot be reduced to a simplistic tale about Protestant founders borrowing a few Enlightenment ideas at a distance. No, the reality is larger and richer and more organic. These men inhabited a civilization already formed by centuries of Christian thought. So even when they were learning through Protestant teachers and Enlightenment authors and British jurists and Republican theorists, they were often receiving downstream of older material that had been needed by Catholic and classical hands. Knowles himself made essentially that point. He said the founders were reading Aquinas 2 degrees removed. Now that's a fair summary, because even that understates the matter, don't get me wrong, but the entire moral atmosphere of the West had been long conditioned by the older synthesis. For example, you take Aquinas' account of the best polity. In the Summa, he says that the best form of government includes one who presides, others who share governing authority, and the people who participate in choosing rulers. You already have there the logic of a mixed constitution, of a separation of powers, ordered towards peace, accountability, and endurance. So when Americans later cherished an executive, a senate, a popular chamber, they weren't inventing political wisdom. They were inheriting an older judgment about man and sin and authority and prudence and the common good. The founders themselves talked about this inheritance. John Adams revered Cicero so deeply that he lamented the loss of Cicero's work on the Republic. He said his authority demanded great reverence. Scholars at Catholic University further note Cicero had a profound influence on Adams and Wilson and Jefferson, and on major intermediaries, Montesquieu and Locke. Now that matters immensely because Cicero carried into the modern world a view of law as reason in accord with nature, a view that the Christian tradition then refined and elevated by grace. So when John Adams and the others spoke the language of virtue and mixed government and moral order, they were talking about an ancient conversation. They weren't creating something entirely novel. Then you've got the School of Salamanca. Serious students of political thought should know far better than they usually do about the school. Stanford Encyclopedia again, it describes Salamanca's central political concern as the aim of a political community, legitimacy of power, relation between ruler and the commonwealth. Vittoria and his successors worked through the nature of society and justice and law and sovereignty and the common good. These theologians helped transmit a specifically Christian account of public authority into the early modern world. And that's why their work reached beyond Spain, beyond Catholic institutions, into the wider European discourse. So yes, if a person's a capitalist or appreciates free market principles, you have a lot to thank from the School of Salamanca. Suarez is one of those theologians. He belonged to that second scholastic revival. John Bellarmine also enters the fray here, although one should speak with precision. The claim that Jefferson owed a direct debt to Bellarmine is debated in scholarship. Cambridge even published a study on the Bellarmine-Jefferson legend. But what I want to point out, though, is Bellarmine's defense of political authority as mediated through the people, or his resistance to an absolutist government, all of those formed the basis of Western constitutional thinking. For me, though, this matters personally and greatly because I've made myself a student of the history of this nation and the history of this nation. In short, I don't just concern myself with the thought of our founders, but the influences of those thoughts. And when I hear Christians speak flippantly as though America sprang into being through a burst of Protestant and secular Enlightenment genius, and the Catholic Church arrived later as a kind of tolerated guest, I see a tremendous historical ignorance. America is marked, unconsciously I can admit, with the residues of Christendom. Even her better Protestant instincts drew from the treasury that was filled by the church, by the fathers, by the doctors, by the biblical vision of man as a creature under God, not raw material for the state. So the Constitution's checks and balances and divided powers make sense because the founders had a sober doctrine about the fallenness of humanity. For example, if you read Federalist 51, it speaks in that same cadence. Government requires internal structure, rival interests, restraints, because human beings are not angels, but they're not fit objects of blind trust either. That sober anthropology harmonizes very well with the Christian doctrine of sin and the need of virtue and discipline. The core issue is that a nation cannot survive very long on inherited moral capital if it continues to deny the source of that capital. Liberty that's severed from truth will curdle into human appetite. Rights that are severed from nature will dissolve into power struggles. Democracy that is severed from virtue becomes a contest of desires and mob rule. The older American understanding, at its best, knew that freedom required moral formation, self-command, reverence, public virtue, and accountability. In fact, several of the Heritage panelists made that point exactly. They stressed that the early Americans distinguished liberty from license. They saw freedom in relation to responsibility and the common good. So yes, Michael Knowles is right. The American founding bears deep affinities with Catholic political philosophy. But there's nothing, virtually nothing original or novel in his statement. But the other urgent thing, though, is that if we don't reclaim the understanding of that heritage, we will lose it entirely. And that's why the church's position is deeper than historical nostalgia. Man is created through Christ, for Christ. Our society finds renewed health when our law serves the truth about the human person, and family, and worship, and moral duty, and the common good. So yes, the political order matters greatly. Cherish what we have in natural law inheritance and in the American founding, but bear the whole thing to its true fulfillment by centering our public life in the Lordship of Jesus Christ. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter.